Cider pressing can be a super fun, tasty family or community event. Every year we host one out here at Middleway Farms. It's a great community event for friends, family to show up. They bring their apples, we press them, we drink a lot of fresh cider. We'll also drink some of the hard cider that we made from the previous year's pressing. Fresh pressed cider is very tasty. This is what most people in the US know when you talk about cider. If you're over in Europe, the cider that they're gonna be talking about is what we would call a hard cider. So that's been fermented over several months to maybe even several years. There are different kinds of presses, between 3 and 7 presses depending on who you talk to. The first one, which is the most common one, is the centrifuge, which chews up your fruit and then spins the liquid out of the pulp. This is a great one if you are working at home and you're going to be drinking your cider or your juice fresh. However, because it's spinning that liquid out of the pulp, it's going to oxidize all of that liquid. And so that's going to cause problems if you're going to be storing that long term. I mean, even just a couple of days, or especially if you're going to be fermenting that. Masticating is another type. A masticating one uses an auger that ends up chewing up that liquid and then pressing it to get that juice out of there. They operate a little bit slower, but they don't oxidize your juice. The next one is a titrating. Titrating is basically 2 augers that rotate and they crush and press your pulp to be able to extract that juice. Both the titrating and the masticating operate a little bit slower, but they're not going to oxidize. Our press uses 2 phases. We've got an auger that grinds up all of our different fruit, turns it into a pulp, and then we slide that fruit forward and we press it here. I'm going to quickly reset this so that I can actually do that. So it goes in the auger or in the grinder and drops down into this basket. We then slide this forward. We wrap up our bag, set our press plate on top of it, slide it forward, and then you rotate this down to press that juice out of the pulp. This is a very effective way, and it's also it will oxidize that juice the least. The first step to pressing cider is collecting apples. Ideally, you want to use apples that are undamaged because any contamination in there is going to cause off flavors. If you wouldn't want to eat that apple, you don't want to be pressing it into cider. The most common apples that we have around here are common table apples or eating apples. These make a great fresh cider. They don't do so well when you start fermenting them. They just don't have the body because they don't have tannin or acid in them. They don't have very much tannin or acid in them. One of the things that I do like adding is crab apples because those are fairly common and they have a lot of tannin and acid in them, so it does boost that, giving the cider a bit more body. Oh, here's an example of a damaged apple. This has been eaten on a fair amount, so bugs have gotten in there. Fruit flies carry an acidic bacteria on their feet. Acidic bacteria turns alcohol into vinegar. So if you're going to be fermenting that, it gets very dangerous that you may end up with vinegar instead of a hard cider. Bruised apples also will tend to contribute some off flavors, so that is less than ideal to use those. A lot of times I will use apples that, as they're falling out of the tree or as I'm collecting them, those tend to be okay. Most apples that are grown in the US are an eating apple, which is very sweet, pleasant to eat. However, these don't have a lot of acid or tannin in them, so they're not going to have as good of body when you ferment them. If you wouldn't serve it to your dinner guest, it probably is a good cider apple. Popularity of cider apples changes depending on what flavors you're liking, and those evolve for a person and they evolve over time. What's a popular cider apple today may not be a popular cider apple 10 years from now. The different kinds of apples are sweet, bittersweet, sharp, and bitter sharp. These classifications are broken down by the content of the acid and the tannin that is present in those apples. Have fun experimenting with different apples. You can do a batch of apple cider that is just one variety of apples, or you can mix and match the different apples, try and boost your flavor and your complexity of the hard cider when you're done with it. Jordan and I have been using a lot of table apples because that's what's available to us. Makes it a little bit harder. We have to do a lot more with tannin and acid balance post-pressing in order to try and get a full-bodied cider. Once you're done picking your apples, you're going to want to store those apples. We like to use these crates. Store them in a cool, dry place, somewhere away from harsh chemicals. Apples will pick up things that are in the air around them. So if you've got harsh chemicals, that's going to be picked up by those apples and it's going to give you off flavors. Storing them in your garage is not a great idea because you've got things with your vehicles that are going to be in there, and those will start to permeate into your apples and then become present in your cider. Next in the steps, we like to weigh them just so we know how much we're going to be pressing. Today we're going to be pressing anywhere between 300 and 800 pounds of apples. So we're running a pretty large operation. You can scale this to whatever size you want. If you have a small bucket of apples, great. Do that. Experiment with, have fun with it. We have big tanks for rinsing and sanitizing our apples. You can do this in a very small tub or a 5-gallon bucket. You want to wash these apples so you get any bugs off of there, any dirt. You then are going to sanitize those. Just as a precaution, if there is any of that acidic bacteria on there, you want to make sure that that is not getting into your cider. Next, if you did choose to use some bruised or blemished apples, you're going to want to cut those bruises and blemishes off, and then you're going to get into your pressing. So the way that our press works is we're going to dump our apples into the hopper. This auger spins, chopping those apples up. It'll then drop into the basket below. After that basket is full, we're going to push that forward, and then we'll close the bag off, drop the plate on top of it, and then slide it forward for pressing. As you're cranking this down, you're going to want to pause periodically. Reason is that water pressure is going to put a lot of back pressure on the crank, on you as you're trying to muscle this down, and on your press. So if you pause, let more of that liquid drain out, then it's going to be a lot easier to continue pressing. One of the things you're going to notice with this press is that it's almost completely made out of wood. You want to be very careful with iron because apples are very acidic and they will pull that iron and carry it into your cider. This will give your cider a metallic flavor. If you are fermenting that cider, it will then turn your cider kind of a greenish or blackish color. There are some old presses that are a cast iron. If you're going to be using that, make sure that iron is very well sealed, because otherwise you are going to have problems with that iron leaching into your cider. After you're done pressing, there's a lot of different uses for what's called the tailings, which is that pulp that's been pressed. You can feed that to livestock. We give a lot of ours to a local hog farmer. Or you can take those tailings, you can dump water on top of it, let it sit out, and create your own apple cider vinegar. This won't be quite as strong as if you were to use your actual juice, but it's a good way to get a double use out of that pulp. You're not going to get all of the sugar out of the pulp. You're not going to get all of the juice out of that pulp. You can drink the fresh cider immediately, or you can ferment it. If you're going to be fermenting it, it's highly advised that you do something to shock the cider, which means that you're going to increase your sulfur dioxide content in there. There's a product called Campton, it comes in a little tablet. You add 1 tablet to 1 gallon of cider. Depending on who you talk to, they'll say that this protects your cider from 24 hours to an ongoing protection throughout the fermentation process. What that acid does is it kills any of the unwanted bacteria and unwanted yeast. Your good hardy yeast that you want, that's a natural occurring on the skin, will survive this, but any of the bad yeasts and bad bacteria that you don't want won't survive it. This acid also, in small quantities, can protect your cider and doesn't affect the taste of the cider. Many times I like to let fresh cider sit on the counter for a day or two, gives it kind of a bubbly effervescentness to it, and then drink it. Changes that flavor just a little bit. I find it to be quite tasty. Occasionally I will let a batch ferment totally wild. I don't shock it, and I don't add any other yeast to it. This can be dangerous. Sometimes you will just get vinegar if you haven't had a real good clean process. If you're using wooden barrels, if it goes to vinegar, most people say that that ruins a barrel. So you won't be able to ferment cider in it ever again. It'll just turn into vinegar. If you're using a new press, it takes a long time for that good yeast to build up on your press. It's going to take several years of doing pressings to get a good culture on there. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to inoculate your cider with that Campton tablet, allow it to shock, and then add your yeast to it. So when you add your Campton tablets, you're going to want to let it sit for 24 hours, then add a yeast starter to it. A yeast starter is where you take your yeast, you add it to water. This gives you 2 things. One, you're going to be able to check and make sure that your yeast is still viable. You're going to start seeing it bubble. Secondly, yeast sometimes has trouble when it goes from being dormant to a high sugar environment. By making a starter, you're giving that yeast a head start so it's active and it's ready to go when it hits your cider. It's going to take off within a couple of days and going to be able to start fermenting that cider immediately. you.